Finally, I'll call on Dr. Bowman.
Thank you. Going last is always the worst. After all these clever and good things have been said. My comments, now is this mic going to do weird things? It's not weird for you, right? It's just weird for us?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, I can tolerate that. I might have a bit of a different slant. I work in a hospital and have done for decades now. I've been working in some of the Toronto hospitals, and I consult in hospitals throughout this country and even at times in other countries as well. And the first thing I want to say is I want to reassure people, because I'm suspecting a lot of the audience may be non-medical, that the vast majority of people, when they reach the end of their lives, have a very gentle and well-respected demise. And unfortunately, and I say this unfortunately, the average Canadian now will die in a hospital or a long-term care facility. That's about over 70%. But for most people, wishes will be stated, families will reinforce those wishes, and when you talk to people afterwards, the families, of course, you find out that, in fact, you know, the passage was really very good and very positive. So I say this unfortunately, but the nature of my work, I'm a medical ethicist, and previous to that I was a medical social worker. I literally have seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. This is a weird job I have, and I admit that, but people die. Honestly, I have. And in recent years, babies a great deal, because I'm at Mount Sinai Hospital and we have obstetrical programs, so I'm often seeing very small preterm babies. So, you know, I've seen a range of these things. I'm not going to claim I know it all, but it's not a perfect system. It's not a perfect system at all. And when I ask healthcare workers, and I won't ask you now, how would you rate the quality of end-of-life care that we deliver in Canada? So these are frontline workers I'm speaking of now. How would you rate that? And I've done this over about an 8-year period across the country. I'm getting a response of largely somewhere around, at best, C+, and often more like C-. This isn't good. This isn't good. Now, if we were to ask the public, it might be even worse. I don't know. Maybe not. But it's okay, but it's not great. But I can tell you, in these downtown Toronto teaching hospitals, you know, that have specialized programs like cardiac transplant and neurosurgery, if you were to say, well, how do we rate our best neurosurgical program in the hospital? C+, heads would roll. It would not be tolerated. But it's quite amazing that, you know, and I'm saying sort of two things here, because most of the end of life is pretty good, but the healthcare workers are acknowledging we've got a long way to go with it, and we need to make it better. So we don't have a perfect system within our hospitals. I believe in palliative care. I've worked in palliative care. It's respectful, it's dignified, and in most cases it works well. But there's some people that don't want palliative care. And there's some people whose symptoms, unfortunately, really, really do get out of control. And there is a subset of people, and if you're wondering, okay, so what's this guy's position? I'm working on it. I'm working on it. And I'm presently doing that publicly. But honestly, I am. And you would think, well, after all these years, maybe you should get it by now. But I don't. I'm sorry to say. I'm still working on it. But that is the reality. There is a subset of people where, you know, things are very, very difficult to treat. And I believe very much in people have fundamental rights. And people really, really do have rights to say, this isn't what I want. And there are people that also say, I don't want to be transferred to palliative care, but you'll love it, and but I won't, and I don't want to go, and I don't want any part of it. So I actually would say there is a problem with, I would say, a fairly small subset of people. But we also have a large social problem in that I think we have a lot of inherent prejudices. I teach in the medical school at the University of Toronto, and when I ask medical students, who in the room wants to work in, transplantation? Lots of hands go up. The emerging field of genetics and genomics, lots of hands go up. This is all sexy stuff. Who wants to work in geriatrics? There's about 2 hands that go up. And then I get usually pretty huffy and start up with my ethics lectures. But really, there is a problem there, because why are you going into medicine if you want to only do sort of sexy aspects? Medicine is about health and healing. The point I make is I think there really are some serious prejudices in our society that are just below the surface. And if a person says, an able-bodied, relatively healthy person says, I wish I was dead, we would react very strongly to that. What? Are you kidding? This person is depressed. Let's work on it. Let's examine it. And I've seen this. If a person with significant disability, let's imagine quadriplegia and maybe some recurrent infection, says, I wish I was dead, many able-bodied people would say, oh, I get that. It must be awful to live like that. But this is coming from people that don't know anything about what it's like to live like that. People that are likely completely out of touch and not understanding what it is like to live with a disability. And, if you look at society in general and you look at the billboards, they don't reflect the average person. They're 20 years old, they're skinny, they're nautilised, they have amazing hair. It's not the average person. And aging is really about the worst thing that could happen to anybody. And this is mounting, and it's woven into marketing. So I would argue that social prejudices are really, really deep. What does this have to do with end of life? I worry that the subtle influences of the kind of life that's worth living is at work in all of us all the time. And largely we're swallowing it whole without a lot of pushback. So I'm very conflicted on this, because I do think we do definitely need to, and I'm not going to give you horror stories at all, but what I am going to say is there is a subset of people where symptoms do get very out of control. And I would say, I'll say to you as an ethicist, it's very hard to justify suffering. And I've never seen any great answer from people that are completely against euthanasia for the people that are in out-of-control suffering, who in fact don't want to continue, but they're depressed. Well, wouldn't you be? It depends on the situation. And I'm talking about serious pain. And pain and suffering are not the same thing, by the way. I think we all know that philosophically. So there is that subset of people. And what do we do about that subset of people? What we do is going to be very different as a society. We're not Americans, and we're not Europeans. And so we have to figure this out in our own way. And we have to figure it out through the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. I suspect it will end up in the Supreme Court of Canada. That's my guess. And I think I would not be surprised if it ends up as a charter challenge. And we will have to figure it out. And, a lot of the arguments about, this isn't about the elderly. This isn't about people with disabilities. This is about people that are dying of something. That's a tough argument, too, because what is lethal? Like the bad jokes, life is lethal, no one's getting out of here alive. But really, honestly, some conditions are clearly lethal, like pancreatic cancer with liver involvement and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's other conditions. It's actually pretty hard to define. So it's hard to go back and forth, and figure it out. But we also have a paradox in Canadian society, and the paradox is that the greatest battles in our hospitals right now are not the fear of what I'm going to call overtreatment. And a lot of this debate related to assisted death or suicide is overtreatment, meaning I am ready to die, I don't want the machines, I don't want anyone keeping me alive, and beyond that, I actually want you to take action to let me die. The largest battles in our hospitals right now are more like the Razuli case, which is in the Supreme Court of Canada, in which families are saying, we think you're giving up on our loved one way too fast. We think you're reacting because, my mother's 85. And in fact, the tension is people that are asking for more treatment, not less. So we've got a very complex continuum going on in Canada right now. On one side, we want the choice for assisted death, and on the other side, we want the choice to continue living even when doctors don't think it's a good idea. So we struggle and we go back and forth on this one. And it's a tough one, and I'm trying to figure out how it works. But I do want to reassure you that for most people, things move along quite well. What's really changed in Canadian society, and most Western societies, death is now a negotiated event. If you go back to something like 1950, death came when it came. Now you have to be fast and you have to be alone. Because honestly, there's a lot of interventions that will intercede, and death, one way or another, is negotiated, whether it's a person in a nursing home and whether they should be on antibiotics or not, life support machines. There's always a negotiation, and so people don't just die as they once did. So, these are some of the things. Let me just take a look at my notes because I want to make sure I've covered all the things that I want to say, and I have all sorts of things to say on everything. Yeah. I mean, that's essentially it. And, the thing, too, is it's very hard, as the other speaker said, for people to predict what they would or wouldn't want in a future situation. And that's what makes it really tough. And that's why we have to judge, lives directly from people, and projecting into the future can be very difficult. I work in Africa a lot, and I was on the plane, and there was a very, very chatty person, and I don't mind talking on planes, but this woman was excessively talkative. I thought, oh my God, and we had just left Pearson, and the plane was going to Johannesburg. So I was very worried about this. So she said to me, what do you do for a living? And I was very tempted to say auto glass or something. But in fact, I said, all these things, and then end of life came up. So she was 32, and what she said to me was, I would never, ever, 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 ever want to be on life support machines. Ever. Never. Never. And so I should have left it alone, but I somewhat baited her. And I said, well, imagine if you were in a small car accident and you've hit your head, you're not breathing so well, and they're going to put you in, and they're going to put you on a breathing machine overnight for observation, but by the morning you're breathing well, and then you're in recovery for a few more hours and you go home. Oh, well, I didn't mean that. But you see, that's the problem when people project into the kind of conditions they would never, ever, ever, ever want to live with. This is one of the concerns. We have to look with some accuracy as to what they would be. Anyway, I've covered, I'm pulling in a lot all over the place here. But, I thought earlier in my career when I worked, and I still work in ICUs, I used to think that a person on life support that's not getting better, and often people on life support aren't able to speak. Some are, but it's not so common. But if they can speak, or their families speak, and they say, they really wouldn't want this, they need to come off life support, I used to think that's ethically a world apart from anything to do with assisted death. That's absolutely not the same thing as to what we're talking about tonight, which is illegal, which is taking action to hasten death, okay? I used to think there's a world of difference. And I realized I was hiding there. I'm not convinced there's a world of difference anymore. I actually think the two things are fairly similar. I don't mean they're interchangeable, and I don't mean one therefore creates the other, but I can't hide there anymore. And I hid there for a long time, thinking that they were really different. I'm not convinced they are anymore. And now I have to find out a way to live with it. Thank you.
Well, there you have it. Some incredibly probing, thoughtful, compelling, diametrically opposed opinions, and on this issue of assisted suicide or assisted death, depending on what term you want to use.